July 16, 1945. The USS Indianapolis sat in the harbor at San Francisco, gleaming in the California sun. Captain Charles McVay III stood on the bridge, reading orders that made his blood run cold. His ship had been selected for the most classified mission of World War II, a mission so secret that even he didn't know the full details. 2 large crates were loaded into the ship's hold under armed guard. The crew whispered among themselves, speculating about the mysterious cargo. Some joked it was toilet paper for General MacArthur. Others guessed it was gold. None of them could have imagined the truth. Inside those crates were components of Little Boy, the atomic bomb that would soon obliterate Hiroshima and change the course of human history. The Indianapolis made the journey to Tinian Island in the Pacific in record time, just 10 days, covering over 5,000 miles at an average speed of nearly 30 knots. The ship arrived on July 26, delivered its deadly cargo, and then set sail for the Philippines. Captain McVay had requested a destroyer escort for the journey, but his request was denied. The Navy brass assured him the route was safe. Intelligence reports showed no enemy submarine activity in the area. They were catastrophically wrong. July 30th, 1945. Just after midnight. Most of the crew of 1,196 men were asleep in their bunks, enjoying the relative calm of the open ocean. The war was winding down. Everyone knew it. Just a few more weeks, maybe months, and they'd be heading home. Lieutenant Commander Hoshimoto Mokatsura peered through the periscope of the Japanese submarine I-58. He couldn't believe his luck. A heavy cruiser, sailing alone, zigzagging but predictably. In the pale moonlight, he could make out her silhouette perfectly. He ordered his crew to prepare a spread of 6 torpedoes. At 12:05 a.m., the first torpedo struck the Indianapolis on her starboard bow. The explosion was catastrophic, igniting aviation fuel and setting off a chain reaction of secondary explosions. 12 seconds later, a second torpedo tore into the ship near the forward engine room, destroying the bottom of the ship and opening her hull to the sea. Private First Class Giles McCoy was thrown from his bunk by the first explosion. The lights went out instantly. In the darkness, he heard screaming, men trapped below decks, men burning, men already dying. The ship began to list immediately. McCoy knew they had minutes at best. The USS Indianapolis had no time to send a distress signal. The communications equipment was destroyed in the initial blast. The ship's public address system was down. Many sailors below decks had no idea what was happening until seawater came rushing through the corridors, trapping them in the darkness. Captain McVay gave the order to abandon ship, but in the chaos, many men never heard it. Within 12 minutes of the first torpedo strike, the mighty Indianapolis rolled to starboard and slipped beneath the waves, her propellers still turning as she plunged toward the ocean floor 12,000 feet below. Approximately 300 men went down with the ship. The remaining 900 found themselves scattered across miles of open ocean in the middle of the night, with no one knowing they were there. The initial moments after the ship went down were pure chaos. Men clung to whatever debris they could find: wooden planks, floating cargo nets, empty ammunition cans. Some had managed to grab life jackets. Many hadn't. Those without flotation devices worked frantically to stay afloat, their legs churning in the dark water. The fuel oil that covered the surface of the ocean was both a blessing and a curse. It calmed the waves slightly, but it also burned the men's eyes, clogged their nostrils, and made many violently ill. Sailors vomited into the oily water, weakening themselves further. As dawn broke on that first day, the survivors could finally see each other. They organized into groups, with those who had life jackets supporting those who didn't. Officers tried to establish order, taking head counts and rationing the few supplies they had managed to salvage. A handful of life rafts had been released from the ship, but there weren't nearly enough for everyone. Dr. Lewis Haynes, the ship's senior medical officer, found himself in charge of a large group of men. He had no medical supplies, no fresh water, no food. All he had was his knowledge and his determination to keep as many men alive as possible. That first day, morale was still relatively high. Surely, someone would notice they were missing. Surely, rescue would come within hours. The Indianapolis was an important ship. The Navy would be looking for them. They had no idea that the Navy didn't even know they were missing. It started with just 1 or 2 dorsal fins cutting through the water. Then more, and more. By the afternoon of the first day, the sharks had arrived in force, drawn by the vibrations in the water, the blood from the injured, and the scent of death that already hung heavy in the air. Most were oceanic white-tip sharks, one of the most aggressive species in the world. These weren't the careful, curious sharks of documentary films. These were opportunistic feeders, and they had discovered an unprecedented feast. The first attack came without warning. A sailor on the edge of one group simply vanished beneath the surface with a brief scream. The water erupted in a red froth. Moments later, the sharks struck again, and again. The men tried everything to defend themselves. They kicked at the sharks. They splashed and yelled. Some groups formed tight circles, the strongest swimmers on the outside, trying to protect the wounded in the center. But there were too many sharks, and the men were too weak, too scattered, too vulnerable. Night brought a special kind of terror. In the darkness, the men couldn't see the sharks approaching. They could only feel the sudden bump against their legs, the brush of sandpaper skin, and then, if they were unlucky, the explosive pain of teeth tearing into flesh. The screams of men being taken in the night haunted those who survived until their dying days. Giles McCoy remembered the sharks taking his friend right beside him. One moment they were talking, trying to keep each other's spirits up. The next, his friend was being dragged under, his screams cut short by the water. McCoy felt something brush against his own leg and kicked with every ounce of strength he had left. Whatever it was, it moved on to easier prey. Dr. Haynes tried to maintain order, but it was becoming impossible. Men were dying every hour. Some from injuries sustained during the sinking, some from exposure, some from the sharks, and increasingly, some from something even more insidious, the slow, creeping madness brought on by dehydration and despair. By the second day, the sun had become as much an enemy as the sharks. The men had no shade, no protection from the relentless Pacific sun that beat down on them, burning their skin, cooking their brains, driving them slowly insane. The salt water was everywhere, on their lips, in their mouths, burning their throats. The temptation to drink was overwhelming. Officers moved through the groups, warning men not to drink the seawater. Everyone knew it would kill you. The salt would dehydrate you faster, shut down your kidneys, drive you mad. But knowing something and having the willpower to resist when you're dying of thirst are two very different things. One by one, men began to break. They would sneak sips when they thought no one was looking. Within hours, the effects became obvious. They began to hallucinate, thrashing in the water, raving about things that weren't there. Some men became convinced the Indianapolis hadn't actually sunk, that it was just below them, and if they dove down, They could get fresh water from the ship's stores. They would take a deep breath and swim downward, never to be seen again. Others hallucinated islands just over the horizon, or Japanese prison ships, or rescue boats that didn't exist. They would swim away from the group, convinced they were heading toward salvation, and disappear into the vastness of the ocean. The worst were the ones who turned violent. Saltwater poisoning, combined with the trauma and the heat, drove some men into a psychotic rage. They would attack their fellow sailors, trying to steal their life jackets, pulling them underwater in their madness. Friends had to fight friends. Brothers in arms had to defend themselves against men they'd served with for years. One sailor became convinced that there was fresh water in the bottom of the ocean. He tried to convince others to swim down with him to get it. When they refused, he attacked them, trying to drown them. It took 3 men to restrain him, and eventually they had no choice but to let him go. He swam downward and never came back up. Dr. Haynes watched in helpless horror as men he'd known for months, good men, brave men, lost their minds before his eyes. He tried to talk them down, to bring them back to reality, but there was nothing he could do. The ocean was breaking them, one by one. 3 days. 4 days. The men had stopped counting. Time had become meaningless, just an endless cycle of brutal sun and terrifying darkness, of fighting off sharks and fighting to stay conscious, of watching friends die and wondering when your own turn would come. The groups had grown smaller. What had started as 900 men scattered across the ocean had dwindled to a few hundred. Bodies floated everywhere, held up by life jackets, a grim reminder of what awaited those who couldn't hold on. Some men simply gave up. They would slip off their life jackets and sink beneath the waves, preferring a quick end to the prolonged agony. Others died in their sleep, or what passed for sleep, their bodies finally giving out after days without water, without food, without hope. Captain McVeigh floated with one group, racked with guilt. His ship had been sunk. His men were dying. He kept replaying the events in his mind. Should he have zigzagged more? Could he have done something differently? The other officers tried to reassure him that he'd done everything right, but the weight of command sat heavy on his shoulders. Meanwhile, back at Leyte Gulf in the Philippines, where the Indianapolis was supposed to have arrived, no one had raised an alarm. The Navy's system for tracking ship arrivals was fatally flawed. When the Indianapolis didn't show up, the port director simply assumed she'd been diverted to another task. No one checked. No one asked questions. The men in the water had no way of knowing this. They still believed rescue was coming. It had to be coming. Any moment now, planes would appear on the horizon. Ships would steam toward them. They just had to hold on a little longer. August 2nd, 1945. Day 4 in the water. Lieutenant Wilbur Chuck Gwynn was piloting a routine patrol bomber over the Philippine Sea. His mission was anti-submarine patrol, not search and rescue. He was hundreds of miles off his planned course, investigating a potential antenna problem. He looked down at the ocean and saw something that made him do a double-take. An oil slick. A massive one. And in the middle of it, could those be heads? Human heads bobbing in the water? Gwynn dropped his altitude and circled back. His blood ran cold. There were dozens of them. Maybe hundreds. Men in the water, scattered across miles of ocean. Some waving frantically, others floating motionless. He immediately radioed his base. Survivors in water. The message sparked frantic activity across the Pacific Fleet. Ships and planes scrambled to the coordinates Gwyn had provided, but they were hours away, and night was falling. Gwyn did something that was technically against regulations, but undoubtedly saved lives. He dropped his life rafts and survival gear to the men below, marking their position. Another pilot, Lieutenant Commander Robert Adrian Marks, went even further. Flying a PBY seaplane, Marks saw sharks circling the survivors. He made the decision to land on the open ocean, an incredibly dangerous maneuver that could easily destroy his aircraft. Marks landed his plane in 12-foot swells and began pulling men from the water. He could only officially carry 15 passengers, but he kept pulling men aboard until he had 56 crammed into every available space. His plane was so overloaded it could no longer take off, but he'd saved 56 lives. As darkness fell, other rescue ships began to arrive. The USS Doyle pulled survivors from the water all through the night, using searchlights despite the risk of Japanese submarine attack. Other ships joined the effort. Sailors threw cargo nets over the side and hauled up men who could barely move, their bodies ravaged by days of exposure, dehydration, and shark attacks. The rescue effort continued into August 3rd. But for every man pulled from the water alive, there were 2 who didn't make it. Some died just as rescue arrived, their bodies finally giving out after holding on for so long. Others were found still wearing life jackets, but dead from exposure or shark attacks. When the last survivor was pulled from the water, the final tally was devastating. Of the approximately 1,196 men who had been aboard the USS Indianapolis, only 316 survived. Nearly 900 had died, some in the initial sinking, but most in the 5 days that followed. It was the greatest loss of life from a single ship in U.S. Navy history. And perhaps more horrifically, it involved the most concentrated shark attacks on humans ever recorded. Nobody knows exactly how many men were killed by sharks versus how many died from exposure, dehydration, or injuries, but survivors consistently reported seeing hundreds of shark attacks over those 5 terrible days. The survivors were taken to military hospitals, their bodies broken, their minds scarred. Many weighed less than 100 pounds, their flesh burned by the sun, their lips cracked and bleeding, their eyes hollow. Some would never fully recover. The nightmares would last for decades. Dr. Haynes survived, though he would spend the rest of his life haunted by the men he couldn't save. Giles McCoy survived, and would later testify at the court-martial that would follow. Captain McVeigh survived, but perhaps he suffered most of all. The U.S. Navy faced a crisis. The war was nearly over. The atomic bombs had been dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan was on the brink of surrender. The last thing the Navy wanted was a scandal about losing a cruiser and 900 men just as victory was being declared. Someone had to take the blame, and that someone was Captain Charles McVeigh III. In what many historians now consider one of the greatest injustices in naval history, McVeigh was court-martialed on charges of hazarding his ship by failing to zigzag and failing to issue timely orders to abandon ship. Never mind that the Navy had failed to tell him about enemy submarine activity in the area. Never mind that the Navy had failed to notice when his ship didn't arrive at port. Never mind that destroyer escort he'd requested had been denied. Incredibly, the Navy even brought in Commander Hashimoto, the Japanese submarine commander who had sunk the Indianapolis, to testify. Hashimoto stated clearly that zigzagging would have made no difference. He would have sunk the ship regardless. But the court-martial proceeded anyway. McVeigh was found guilty of hazarding his ship. Though he was not punished and was restored to duty, his career was effectively over. He would carry the weight of the disaster for the rest of his life. The survivors rallied around their captain. They knew the truth. They knew McVeigh had done everything he could. Many wrote letters defending him, testifying to his character and his leadership. But the Navy needed a scapegoat, and McVeigh was it. For decades, the story of the USS Indianapolis remained relatively unknown. The Navy didn't publicize the disaster. Survivors were scattered across the country, many struggling with what we now recognize as PTSD, many reluctant to talk about what they'd endured. The survivors of the USS Indianapolis formed a tight-knit group, meeting regularly to remember those who didn't make it and to support each other through the trauma they all shared. They never stopped fighting to clear Captain McVeigh's name. Captain McVeigh himself struggled profoundly. He received hate mail from families of men who died, people who blamed him for the loss of their loved ones. The Navy's court-martial had made him the official scapegoat, and he bore that burden with quiet dignity. But the weight eventually became too much. On November 6, 1968, Charles McVeigh III took his own life. He was found outside his home, holding his Navy-issued revolver, with a toy sailor from his childhood clutched in his other hand. He was 70 years old. The survivors were devastated but not surprised. They'd seen the toll the disaster and its aftermath had taken on their captain. They redoubled their efforts to clear his name. It would take decades, but eventually justice, of a sort, was served. In 1996, the story of the USS Indianapolis was featured prominently in the film Jaws, when the character Quint recounted his experience as a survivor. The movie brought new attention to the disaster. A 12-year-old boy named Hunter Scott became fascinated with the story and launched a campaign to exonerate Captain McVeigh. He interviewed nearly 150 survivors, gathered evidence, and presented his findings to Congress. In 2000, Congress passed a resolution exonerating McVeigh and stating that his court-martial was morally unjust. In 2001, Navy Secretary John Gordon formally cleared Captain McVeigh's record, noting that McVeigh's court-martial was a miscarriage of justice and that he had been unjustly blamed for the sinking. The wreckage of the USS Indianapolis was finally discovered in 2017, resting in over 18,000 feet of water in the Philippine Sea. The discovery brought closure to many of the remaining survivors and families of the lost. The disaster of the USS Indianapolis led to major changes in U.S. Navy procedures. Never again would a ship's non-arrival at port go unnoticed. Communication protocols were overhauled. The system for tracking vessels was completely redesigned. But the human cost can never be calculated. 880 men died in the worst maritime disaster in U.S. Navy history. They died from injuries, from exposure, from dehydration-induced madness, and from shark attacks in numbers never seen before or since. The survivors who lived to tell the tale were forever changed. Many suffered from severe PTSD, though it wasn't called that at the time. They had nightmares about the sharks, about the screams of their friends, about the endless days in the burning sun with no hope of rescue. Some couldn't swim in the ocean ever again. Some couldn't even take baths, the feeling of being surrounded by water triggering immediate panic attacks. Some became alcoholics, trying to drown the memories. Others found strength in each other, in the bonds formed during those 5 terrible days when survival had required every ounce of courage and determination they possessed. The story of the USS Indianapolis stands as a testament to human endurance, to the will to survive even in the most horrific circumstances imaginable. It's a story of courage and cowardice, of sacrifice and selfishness, of the best and worst that humans are capable of when pushed to the absolute limit. It's also a reminder that sometimes the greatest battles aren't fought with guns and bombs, but with the simple determination to stay alive for one more hour, to hold on for one more day, to keep hoping even when all hope seems lost. The last survivor of the USS Indianapolis, Harold Bray, died in 2019 at the age of 96. With his passing, the final first-hand account of those 5 days in shark-infested waters was lost. But the story lives on, a dark chapter in naval history that must never be forgotten, both as a memorial to those who died and as a lesson to those who serve. If you found this story as haunting as we did, smash that like button and subscribe for more incredible true stories from history. Drop a comment below telling us what part of this nightmare shocked you the most. And if you think Captain McVeigh deserved better, let us know in the comments. We'll see you in the next one. Stay curious, and remember, truth is always stranger than fiction.